Bienvenidos a un capítulo más de Diálogos Sensoriales. En esta ocasión seguimos viajando vía online a los Estados Unidos, en particular a la zona donde está por ahí ubicado Kansas State. Y tengo el enorme placer de platicar con una autoridad en el área, que es el profesor Edgar Chambers. Professor, welcome to Diálogos Sensoriales. It's an honor to speak with you.
Very nice to be here.
Perfect. Let's start this conversation with what the pivotal question. Let's say, why and when did you arrive into the sensory science field?
Actually, I decided I wanted to be a food scientist when I was about 10 years old.
Wow.
I didn't even know the field existed, but I knew that was I loved working with food, and I loved working with making things that and figuring out how they made the best products.
Right.
And so I went to undergraduate school and then went on to graduate school and thought I was going to be a starch scientist until I met my mentor, Dr. Jean Call, and we just clicked. The minute I met her, I thought, this is the woman I want to work with. And she was a sensory scientist, and I loved the human part of things. So that's when I decided that was what I was going to do.
Wow.
And yeah, so I've known since graduate school that I was going to be a sensory scientist.
And is there a project or a key moment that inspired you to confirm that part?
I think I was taking a class from Jean, and she was a very a little bit rigid, and I did something in her class that wasn't what she wanted, and she slapped the table really hard. We were in a lab, and she slapped the table really hard, and she goes, "That's not the way we do things." And I thought, wow, this woman really has a passion for what she does. and I went, oh wow, huh? And so we talked a little more, and as I was taking her class, it just kind of hit me. This is really about understanding human behavior and understanding what makes people tick about the foods they eat, the shirts they wear, the shampoo they have in their hair, whatever, the automobiles they drive. And I just went, whoa, this is me.
Wow. So from that time until now, you have been involved in many projects as a professional and as a professor as well. Which side did you enjoy the most, or are you enjoying the most?
Um, uh, my initial training was in descriptive sensory analysis, and that's the part I would say I love. And I love it because I think it's such an important part of sensory to understand what the specific characteristics are of the product. But beyond that, my most recent work has been in more the consumer behavior side of things, trying to understand why people like those things. So we know what the characteristics are. Now let's understand why people like those characteristics. But I keep going back to the descriptive work because if you don't really understand what the product is, you can't really understand why people like it. You have to be able to understand the product before you understand why people like that product.
Yeah, and based on that, the developing of this sensory lexicon is an area that you have been working
Yes.
many times.
Yeah.
Is there a general way to build that lexicon? How easy it is? It's complicated. Anybody can do that.
If you have well-trained panelists, it becomes relatively easy to do because the panelists build it for you. It's not about me and what I think. It's about what a group of very well-trained people who participate in these studies on a regular basis think about products, and it transcends products. So it's, my most recent publication actually on lexicons was on a lexicon for a variety of kimchi products. So kimchi is a fermented vegetable, spicy vegetable that they mix that they like in Korea. It's becoming more popular in the United States. We had previously done work in Korea and published that. We now came to the US and looked at a whole variety of things, but a whole variety of kimchi products made from cabbage or onion or spring onion, radish, all kinds of things. But it's really not that different in developing a lexicon for that than it is for developing a lexicon for coffee, which we've published, than developing a lexicon for fish that we've published, to developing a lexicon for any kind of product. So we've looked at, for example, automobile paint finishes, and it's just the same visual aspects, but obviously in much more detail with paint finishes than it is with kimchi. Kimchi is more about the smell and the flavor, but has some visual aspects as well. Anyway, so it's you start with a well-trained panel, you give them the products, you give them any background information that you can, and then you keep questioning what they're giving you, the kind of information they're giving you. You say, they say, well, it tastes like this. And you go, okay, but describe that in more detail. So for example, when we start training panelists, we always start with applesauce. Smashed apples. It's ground apple. And because in the US it's quite a popular product and it's easy to deal with. So we make applesauce from fresh apples. We make applesauce from cooked apples. Well, what's the difference between the flavor of those two things? They both taste like apples, but they taste different. So how do you describe the difference? So you compare those two and say, well, this one has this extra brown flavor. This one's a little more sweet. This one's a little more sour. And the same thing is true if you have red apples or yellow apples or some other variety of apples. Then you add flavor to the apple. So you add cinnamon or some other flavoring to the apples. Okay, now what's different about it? Oh, okay, this has a spice level, a spice note in it. And they just keep describing in greater detail and greater detail. And eventually you come to the point that there's nothing more to say. And you've got the lexicon.
And you of course, if there are any question about that burnt note or whatever, you can use guidance or like references or something like that, right?
And we have this word, this term for some flavor or texture or vision aspect of the product. Then we have a reference. We have a definition of that. So what does that mean? So what does it mean to say something is smoky? And then typically there's a reference for that. And what we found is that you can take things down to various levels. So we have, let's use the word musty, for example. Musty is I'm not sure how that translates in Spanish, but it's musty is a term that people, oh, yeah, this smells a little bit musty, or it's old, or it's kind of damp, or whatever. But when you really start evaluating musty, you find out things aren't just musty. There's musty, dusty, like an old library or an old library book. And there's musty, earthy, like you're out digging under the leaves in the forest or something, and it's begun to decay. Then there's decaying vegetation. So it's kind of like you've cut the grass or you've cut something down. The leaves are beginning to fall and they're green still and they're starting to rot. It's musty, but it has a different musty smell. So there's musty, dusty, there's musty, earthy, there's musty potato, there's musty decaying vegetation. There's all these different sorts of musty ideas. And you just keep breaking it down until you can't break it down anymore.
Right. So you have like guidance to people understand that. And using that sensory analysis, descriptive techniques, and etc., how can this sensory influence works with the perception of food safety, for instance? How people can understand if that is well for me, for my body. Is that possible?
It is and it isn't. So there are some things you can do with sensory and some things obviously you can't. When you talk about food safety, it's amazing the kinds of things that people do to test for food safety in their own home.
Right.
But obviously, they look at it to see if it looks fresh or not fresh, or does it look moldy? Does it look whatever? And if it's not supposed to be moldy, unless it's a mold ripened cheese or something, if bread has mold on it, they go, oh, this is not safe anymore. Okay. With meat, for example, it's a matter of you don't want to taste it, although people do, but people will smell it. Does it still smell okay? They don't think it smells okay, they throw it away. The problem is smelling or tasting in those situations isn't often very reliable. But what we find is that there are sensory aspects of things that can make it more reliable. So let's take, for example, cooking meat. If I cook meat and this is work that we have done, looking at sort of the consumer behavior and related sensory aspects of cooking meat. So if I cook meat and I want it cooked to a certain level of doneness, I can cut it open and look and see, does it look like it's done to what I want? Does it still have pink in the middle, or is it fully brown in the middle, for example? Once it's fully brown in the middle, people can know, oh, that's pretty safe. They think. That isn't always true. So we tell people, don't rely on the sensory judgment of the vision of the meat. Rely on the temperature of the meat, which actually also is a sensory measure. You're looking at a thermometer, and you have to have something that you can see and something that's accurate that you can actually measure. And you have to get people to do that. Sometimes people, they don't like to use thermometers. They like to just look at with their eyes, or hope with their, I've timed it long. Yeah, with the hand, they touch it, or well, it's 5 minutes on each side, it's done. But since that isn't very reliable, we've tried to look at methods that will help people to remember to use a thermometer or wash their hands or whatever. And what we've learned is, and the U.S. Department of Agriculture is now including this in their guidelines, along with our Food and Drug Administration. When people write recipes, we recommend that they actually put those guidelines in the recipe. So instead of saying test for doneness, take out your thermometer, stick it in the center of the meat, and check that it is at a specific temperature. Or a very simple step like at the beginning of the recipe, wash your hands. Those are visual cues to people. It's a sensory thing. It's a visual cue that tells them, do this step and your food will be more safe. Your cooking will be more safe.
Right.
So it's all again related to this whole consumer behavior aspect of understanding what the sensory cues are to get people to either do something or like something better or handle something in a specific way.
Right. So sensory science is like crucial, let's say, to understand this consumer behavior and the development of the products.
It absolutely is. As I said at the beginning, if you don't understand the product, you can't understand why people like that or do what they do with it.
Right. Yeah. What are in your opinion the common challenges that companies face when trying to develop the sensory department into their products?
I think one of the key aspects is time. Sensory takes time. Right. It's not something you can just you can't in 15 seconds you can't put it through an instrument and get it right. But then so it takes time, and it takes human resources. It takes people to do it. There is not yet an instrument, although we have human noses, or we have electronic noses or electronic tongues. They're pretty good assessments to do some quality control sorts of things in a situation where you're just putting the same thing through each time. But they're not very good at telling you what's in the product. They're not very good about they can tell you, well, it's got this much sugar in it, or it's got this level of, we think, sweetness, until you put a non-nutritive sweetener in it, or you put an artificial sweetener in it, and what happens? The machine has no clue what the sweetness level is supposed to be.
Right.
So you still have to have that human back behind you, and it's time, and time is money. But once you have a very good panel trained to do what they do, it doesn't take a lot of time to get that done, as long as you have a system in place that regularly tests things. If you only test things here and there, then it's better to go to a consultant or go to a consulting firm to do it, because their panel is more up to date and more knowledgeable and more regular. But if you're a large company or even a smaller company that really does sensory testing on a regular basis, even if it's just for visual cues, because many companies that make sort of ready to eat products, a lot of times they're really looking at what's the visual cue here to say that it's done, or what's the visual cue to say that it's ready to be sent to the consumer. They know the formula's right. They got that right. So let's make sure it's brown enough, or it's toasted enough, or whatever the case may be. In those cases, when you're doing things regularly, you can fairly easily set up a panel. It just takes time to get them well trained, and that's the key: well trained.
Correct. You insist in that part, train, because I have seen in many papers that they use semi-trained panel. What do you think about those semi-trained panel?
One of my colleagues, Hildegard Heyman at University of California at Davis, stated years ago, she wrote a paper years and years ago when she was at the University of Missouri, that said, what you're testing makes a difference on how much training you need. If you're smelling for cat urine, so if you're smelling kitty litter, for example, and you're trying to determine whether it takes away the cat urine odor, you don't have to train very hard at all. It's pretty obvious if it worked or not. One good training session can get you to understand what the smell of kitty litter is supposed to be and what it's not supposed to be. And another colleague of mine, Dov Basker, who's now deceased, but was an Israeli sensory scientist, wrote, back in the 70s, I think, wrote, it doesn't take much to tell the difference between an apple and an orange. It's very easy to do that. So you don't need a lot of training to do those kinds of tasks. What you need training for is when you're looking for the small differences. So if you're looking at the big picture, if you're trying to understand that, for example, differences in orange juice, if you're just looking at really kind of the big differences in how watery it is, how pulpy it is, how orange or not orange it is, it doesn't take a whole lot of training. Consumers can do that pretty easily, and they get it mostly right. If you're really trying to understand this, it takes more training. If I'm really trying to understand the texture of a blended food, for example, or a soup, it takes a lot more training to really understand the textural aspects of that than it does just to say, yeah, it tastes like soup. Yeah, I've got some carrot here. I've got some celery. I got crunchy. It's whatever. It's soft. But you really want to understand what those textural differences are. It takes more training. And flavor is even more difficult, because flavor, texture has sort of a finite number of attributes. My colleague Gail Seville will just kill me if I say this, but they're ultimately just not as many textural attributes as there are flavor attributes, and she would say that too. It's sometimes harder to describe those textural attributes because they change over time. Flavors do too, but the texture is a little more finite, so it's easier to train. The flavor is much more difficult because there are literally thousands of flavors. And especially if you're trying to look at the very small differences in those flavors. So this one has a little bit of West Indian nutmeg, and this one has a little bit of East Indian nutmeg. There's subtle differences between those that a consumer would never be able to describe. But trained panelists can describe, and we have had them describe those differences. So the amount of training depends on how in-depth you want to know something about, or you want to know about something. It also depends on how big the differences are in the products. An apple and an orange, pretty easy to tell the difference.
Right.
So back to your, I'm going on a little long, but I want to come back to this because people say, oh, well, consumers give you basically the same information as a trained panel. They do at a big level, at the overarching, the forest level.
Right.
When you really want to study the trees and the leaves, it takes more training. And that's where somewhat of a semi-trained panel comes in. They can study the trees, and then a very highly trained panel can look at the leaves on the trees and tell you what's different there. How important that is to the consumer, we don't know until we've studied that. So if the main difference, for example, in a soft drink, if the main difference in liking is sweetness, well, I can use a less trained panel to tell me about sweetness. But if the main difference in that cola beverage, for example, is the difference in East Indian and West Indian nutmeg, I need a very highly trained panel to do that.
Right. Understood. Thanks. And well, the Sensory Analysis Center at Kansas State, of course, is a very nice, recognized worldwide. What do you think has been that differentiating factor in achieving this leadership in the sensory field?
I think it's a couple of things. The first thing is we established early on that we were experts in descriptive analysis. And then as the field was beginning to grow and do more consumer testing, we again established early on that we were good at consumer testing and we could do that. And we never shied away from doing a project just because it was an international project. So we've done so many international projects in so many countries. And when you do those, obviously you meet people and they remember you. Right. You give presentations and they remember you. And we also have never shied away from working in fields outside of traditional food sensory. So we've done cosmetics. We've published papers on cosmetics. We've published papers on fabrics. We've published papers on computer screens and how people operate with computers. We have published papers on so many different things like that that are outside the field of food that people go, well, isn't sensory mostly about food? And the answer is no. It's about any product that you can taste, touch, smell, feel, hear, see, you name it.
Right. What's the most difficult or challenging product that you have been described or in a project? I mean,
I think the most challenging projects are projects that work with fresh food.
Okay.
Because when you work with things like fruits and vegetables, obviously there are maturity differences. So if you're working with a tomato, for example, here's a tomato and a panelist gets this part of this tomato, but another panelist gets a part of another tomato. And in fact, they're not exactly the same level of ripeness, or they're not exactly the same size, or they don't have exactly the same visual characteristic. When you're working with meat, from one end of a muscle to the other end of the muscle changes in texture and sometimes in flavor. So you have to really be careful about how you present products to the panelists so that they can get a consistent product. And each of the panelists that's working with you then can give you information that matches what the other panelists say. If you just willy-nilly give them, okay, here's an apple, here's an apple, here's an apple, you all taste your apples, and you haven't made sure that they're really, I mean, if they're going to be chopped up, they should be mixed together first so everybody gets bites of different apples or gets groups of apples together. So I think those are sometimes the most difficult in terms of making sure that the product is consistent in terms of actually determining the characteristics of products, I think the most difficult ones are products that are not like their main ingredient. So, for example, when you talk about bread, bread doesn't taste like flour. You know, it has a completely different flavor. Once you put the flour and the yeast in and water and mixed it together and added whatever else you're going to add to it, the flavor of the bread changes. You don't taste flour anymore. Yes, you get a little yeasty and some salty, but there are a whole different range of flavors depending on what that flour is and how strong it is and how long it's been fermented. And so things like that, or things like complex soups or stews, or where the flavor is so blended. I mean, think of a Coca-Cola. Now, I used to work for the 7-Up company, and we tested soft drinks of all kinds.
Right.
Coca-Cola is an incredibly difficult product to test with descriptive methods because it's so well blended. It's very hard to determine what the actual attributes are. You can do it. We've done it. But it's very hard to do. And that's the kind of product, if you don't have a well-trained panel, you're not going to have any success.
Right. Thank you. Thank you for that. Let's change a little bit the dynamic. I will ask you some per comparison questions, and please let me know which one do you prefer.
Okay.
Tetra testing or triangle test?
Is they each have their place. I think that triangle testing in the end is a bit easier to do for most people. It doesn't require complex levels of statistical knowledge. It doesn't really require you to do much. You can look it up in a table and figure it out. But to do it right is hard. So I'm going to say triangle testing just because I think if you understand what triangle testing is, I think it's a good method. But truly, I think it depends on what you're testing as to which method you use.
Okay.
Sorry, long answer to a short question.
No, fine. Thank you. City or forest?
Forest.
Traditional descriptive analysis or rapid methods?
Oh, traditional descriptive analysis.
7-Up or Sprite?
Right. I used to work for the 7-Up company. Sprite's a little more limey.
Analytical or consumer testing?
I can't choose. I think they're both so important.
we have a missing answer here. Okay. Consulting or teaching?
Oh, consulting.
Parametric or non-parametric statistics?
Parametric.
Breakfast or dinner?
Dinner.
And preference mapping or PLS?
So I'll choose preference mapping.
Okay, thank you for your answers. Let's move to the final part of the interview. Okay. And based in your experience and of course in your opinion, how do you think artificial intelligence and big data are impacting or can impact the conducting of sensory evaluation?
I think it's going to have a huge impact, and I think it's going to impact. Actually, I think it's going to impact analysis first. I think people are already beginning to use. You look at some of the blogs out there from sensory scientists or people who have been sensory scientists and have moved into other areas. You'll find that it's already being used to figure out how to analyze data better. So various aspects are being used to say, okay, how can I take this set of data I have and more easily analyze it in R or with Python or whatever, instead of having to code SAS or code SPSS or whatever. You can now ask an artificial intelligence information scheme to give you ideas on what the best way to analyze this data might be. You still have, it's not That's in its infancy, but it's coming. As that comes, and we start to build databases that are very thorough and complete, it's going to be much easier to understand the sensory consequences of making a specific decision. And let me give you a rather odd example, but this will help. So it's not an odd example. Let's take beanie, a paper, some work we've done and published on. If you take the term beanie, which is in many plant-based meat systems, for example, or meat alternatives, you find very quickly that beanie is a negative aspect in most of the world. People don't want things, they don't want meat products or things that they perceive to be, should have meaty flavor to be beanie. Okay. Things like even soy milk or whatever, that's got a bad reputation because it can be beanie in flavor. And when you look at the literature, it's very difficult to determine what causes beanie flavor. There are certainly chemical compounds that are beanie in themselves, but they're not necessarily the most important beanie compounds in soy milk. And various authors have said things like, chemicals that cause green flavor cause beanie flavor. Well, if you taste that chemical, you find out very quickly it has no beanie flavor whatsoever. It's just not beanie. So, well, how can that cause beanie flavor? Well, the idea is when you combine two chemicals together, neither of which are beanie, but you put them together in a system that just has those two chemicals and some water in it, all of a sudden the water tastes beanie. And you're going, where did this come from? And that's a very difficult thing to track. So it's sort of like the flavor chemistry is on this side and the sensory is on this side, and we still don't have a good understanding of how the relationship exists. AI is going to help us with that so much. It's going to really help us move from when we have very big databases of data from this chemistry, and we have the corresponding databases of the sensory aspects. Trying to understand those relationships is going to be much easier because those big analyses that can be done with those systems and through AI will begin to help us. Wow. So if you combine this category of chemical with this category of chemical that has this free radical on it, it's going to cause this flavor. Amazing. That's going to help us so much because we don't always need to or want to smell things or taste things. We come back to the food safety issue. We did a lot of work for the U.S. Department of Agriculture and other agencies on grain, raw grain, and storage of grain. And when grain is stored, it can begin to get some odors that aren't very nice. And the traditional way of determining whether or not that grain has other foreign odors, it contains other foreign odors, it's called COFO. The way that's done is an inspector takes a triangular shaped pan, scoops it into the grain, pulls it up to his nose and goes and sniffs it 3 or 4 times. When he does that, if there's anything that's not healthful in there, he's inhaling that. That's not good. We shouldn't be having grain inspectors do that unless we're pretty confident that the grain is safe. It's much easier if we have instruments that can do that for us, and much more, I will say, consistent, because not all inspectors have the same nasal capabilities or whatever. They're all well trained, but they don't all have exactly the same capabilities. Anyway, if we can make sure that that's actually going to determine that something contains a foreign odor, but those systems aren't available yet. People say we've got electronic noses, they can do that. But electronic noses have to be trained for the odors that they think are present. Mm-hmm. We know that there are more than 100 different odors in raw grain, and some of them just are out of the blue. It comes once in a who knows how many times. So, for example, we tested 400 samples of raw grain, and lots of them were musty, and lots of them had insect odors, and lots of them had moldy odors or whatever. Many of them didn't, of course. Mm-hmm. Only one of them suddenly had this odd chocolate smell in it. Where did this come from? We don't know. But the point is, the electronic nose would never have known what that was because it wasn't, we would never have trained an electronic nose on grain to say, oh, chocolate odor. It just wouldn't have happened.
Right.
So, but once we get AI involved and we can build those systems into that equipment, it will be much easier to do initial screening to help us determine whether it's even worthy of going forward into a sensory test or into a consumer study.
So it will help, not replace, right?
No, it won't replace. It will help.
Right. What will be the big question in the next 5-10 years that the sensory science must answer or try to pursue the answer?
Fundamental level, the field has got to come together and understand that it's not an either-or situation. It's not descriptive methods, discrimination methods, or consumer methods. They have to work together. We still aren't there yet. We give lip service to this, oh, they're all important, but then we go off and in many cases, especially in not so much in North America, but especially in Europe, for example, they're hardly doing the academic field is hardly doing any descriptive sensory work with trained panels, partly because of employment situations there, partly because of it's just not they've used a lot of consumer work to define what the sensory characteristics are. It's just not going to help us reach the level of detail we need. So we've got to move back to these descriptive methods to do that, but we can't just live on the U.S. for a long time lived on descriptive methods. Oh, we did descriptive. I've seen so many descriptive studies that were done and nobody ever paid attention to them because nobody ever understood how to translate that data into consumer data. So we've got to come together on that. That's a big one. But personally, so that's important, but personally, the thing that I think we all have to work harder on is working with our clients to understand what the sensory data are telling us. And when I say our clients, I don't mean me as a consultant working with a client outside of the Center for Sensory Analysis and Consumer Behavior. I mean, if you work in a company, you have a client, and your client is the product developer, the marketing person, the quality control person, manufacturing, whoever you're doing work for and with. You've got to be able to translate that data that you're gathering into useful information. You have to be able to tell my favorite 2 words, the so what of the data. Right. You have to understand so what. You've got to translate that. We sometimes say, here's the data, and we hand it off to the product developer, and the product developer goes, okay, and what do I do with this? And you say, oh, just kind of increase the sweetness, or you can tell there's a difference here, there's a difference here, there's a difference here. This is different than that, this is different than that. Telling people this is different doesn't help them understand how they can implement that into their job. So I personally think the thing we have to figure out in the next few years is how we're going to stay sensory scientists and help people integrate that information into their jobs, as opposed to becoming more and more like market research, where we're just running consumer studies with extra sensory information in it and saying, here's some more data. We have to be the knowledge base of sensory characteristics of our product and help the rest of the company and the rest of our clients, if it's not within a company, understand what that means to them.
Right. Huge.
Tell them the so what.
Yes. Okay, thanks. And let's say that we have you have a time machine and you have the possibility to travel at a moment of where Edgar kid at 10 years is like playing with stuff and realizing that sensory is important, what can you tell to him?
Future or the past?
Well, the past.
The past. Okay. So if I'm going to go back and tell somebody about the importance of sensory, I'm going to start way back. The first sensory test is in the first book of the Bible. It's in if you use the Christian Bible or you use the Jewish Torah or even in some aspects of the Quran. In most places, most religions of the world, there's a beginning, and the beginning is when God said, he created the earth, and in the Christian Bible it says he created this, he created that, and he said it was good. That's the very first consumer study. God said it's good.
Nice.
But moving forward a little bit, you've got to tell somebody that sensory is important. The pharaohs of Egypt already knew this. They created perfumes and the Chinese created perfumes many millennia ago. Our Asian society, I shouldn't call them Chinese, they weren't China at the time, but the Asian societies and the Egyptians created perfumes. They created things to create good smells and to make people smell better or to make objects smell better. They understood that concept, and somewhere along the way, we lost that. We lost the idea that sensory is really important because it's what determines whether people use and like what they get. How do we, and I think part of it is to some extent in the Middle Ages, we were so just trying to feed ourselves, period, just trying to stay alive, that anything was okay. If you could eat it, it was okay. But we've reached the point in the last 100 years or so, or even longer than that, where food has to be good to be eaten. If it's not good, people might eat it if it's just people don't even eat it if it's the only thing available. They'll find something else they like better and eat that. Right. But we found that even in projects in Africa where we were giving people food, if they didn't like it, if they didn't like what we gave them, they would trade it for something else, whether it was nutritious or not. But I think just that understanding of saying, if you don't like it, you won't eat it, and if you don't eat it, people aren't going to buy it. So that's what would I tell them? Remember back to Egyptian times, back to ancient times when people knew sensory aspects were important and they created things to make things better.
Right. Thank you. Well, time flies and we need to end this interview at this moment. But is there any publication, paper, poster, book that you want to suggest to our sensory audience?
I think there are several good ones out there. For a very basic book, the ASTM manual on sensory testing, I co-edited with Mona Wolf, and then now Mona has edited it herself. Or if you're looking for something a bit more complete, Mielgaard, Seville, and Carr, the sensory analysis or sensory evaluation techniques book is an excellent guide towards using sensory in many ways, and it's been translated and available widely. So,
right. Thank you. Is there anything else you want to share with us?
No, I love this job. I love what I do, and I hope that other people will too, because I think it really does make a difference to people. It's amazing how important products are to people, and creating better products makes for better lives. Right.
Yeah. Thank you so much again, Professor Edgar, for you to be with us into this interview.
Thank you.
Thanks for your opinions, and see you maybe at Pangborn. I don't know.
Yeah, I probably won't be there, but I'm actually going to be out of the country. So.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Perfect. But, so maybe in other Congress. Thank you.
In other Congress, yeah.
Thank you so much. And ustedes, muchas gracias por vernos. Si les gustó, denle like y compartan. Si no, simplemente no digan nada. See you next time. Bye, bye.